is understanding Snapchat. After watching this video, you should be prepared to explain the overwhelming user base of Snapchat and the types of businesses that find it most appealing. To examine your business's primary target audiences for potential Snapchat compatibility, and to outline potential limitations of Snapchat marketing. When it comes to thinking about which social media channels you might want to incorporate as part of your marketing efforts, one of the main things we need to look for is when a channel has reached what we would call the point of viability. Basically, the point in time when there's enough of an active user base to say this is more than just a small, tiny little, third level social media channel, and it's become something that overall would make sense for a larger portion of companies to look at. And that's kind of what we've seen Snapchat reach, is they've established themselves not necessarily as a top-tier social media channel like a Facebook or like a YouTube, but they're solidly entrenched as a second-tier social media channel, which would put them in with, say, Pinterest and LinkedIn as the type of channel that has a good amount of people using it, but doesn't really cover across the board every single individual person. So basically what that means to you is that, well, it's worth exploring, and it's certainly reached a point that you need to understand what it is and why it works and how it might impact your business. You also have to recognize that there's simply the possibility that it might not be suitable to your business. In fact, at this stage of the game, there's probably going to be more companies that are going to say it's not necessarily worth the extra resources than companies who say this is someplace that we absolutely must be. But for certain types of audiences and for certain types of businesses, Snapchat has reached the point where it opens the door to a lot of possibilities. Now, with over 200 million active users each month, Snapchat has definitely crossed that threshold to become a channel worth understanding and considering. But it's important to understand some things about the user base of Snapchat. Now, whereas most social media channels these days have grown to include a wide range of ages into the mix, Snapchat is still one that is primarily dominated by millennials, and actually also the even younger crowd. It tends to be 13-year-olds to 29-year-olds are the most dominant population and the highest usage rate on this site. And basically with Snapchat, you can kind of think of it as sort of a less filtered stream of consciousness social sharing network. So whereas what people put on Instagram, they may think about a little more carefully and pose a picture, just right, make sure everything's perfect. And what they put on Facebook might be sort of what they've deemed acceptable for everybody to see because it's the place where they have the most connections. Because the content that goes on Snapchat tends to be viewed by a smaller number of people, and because it's a little bit easier to sort of contain who's going to have access to it, it becomes a little bit more real to the personality of who the individual people are. They tend to feel like they can be a little bit more themselves on that site. So Snapchat is a little less polished and a little more kind of comfortable and easygoing than some of the other channels. Now, Snapchat usage is definitely growing. Well, it's been around for several years now. Just in the last year, we've seen a 350% increase in the amount of videos that people are watching. That number comes in at over 10 billion videos a day being watched by Snapchat users now. And that's really a pretty astonishing growth rate. And it's really the thing that has kind of tipped it over into that point of viability and really made it the type of channel that companies need to consider taking a look at and seeing if there might be space to market on. Now, there's several things that make Snapchat different from some of the other options out there. One of the big ones is that Snapchat offers people sort of a direct interaction between friends. There's several different types of content that you can post, and we'll go over those a little bit later in the video. But the thing to really keep in mind is that users have the option of saying, I'm going to take this picture, or I'm going to shoot this little video, or I'm going to write this message, and I'm going to send it to just 3 of my friends or 4 of my friends. The same way that they might use SMS messaging, or they might use a program like, WeChat or Line to just connect with a couple of people, but they're able to do it in the environment of sort of a more traditional social media channel. So it's a little bit easier to have that more personal touch to it, because that interaction is happening more via either direct contact or small group contact. The other big thing that comes with it is the messages that are sent in those sort of direct messaging back and forth with people. Once they're viewed, they vanish, like they expire, they're gone, there's no record of them. So for a lot of users, especially in that younger generation that have started to worry, well, what I put on Facebook, that might come back and haunt me later, maybe my grandmother will see it or an employer will see it, and they want to feel the freedom to be a little bit more themselves without necessarily having to worry about, the longer term repercussions. They tend to really like and appreciate that the content has a really short lifespan. So that's less anxiety for them. Now, the other thing that kind of comes into play is this quote from Connor Jones at Go Fish Digital, where he explains that Snapchat doesn't really have a social ripple effect. And what we mean by that is if you post something to Facebook, it might sit there for, a couple hours or for a day, and maybe 1 or 2 people see it and comment on it. But then maybe on that second day, someone new sees it and they post a comment, and then their friends see it and they come in and post a comment. And pretty soon there's a completely different conversation going on than what you intended. Or maybe one of your friends shares it, and then their followers get to see it, and one of their friends shares it. And things kind of take on a life of their own, that sort of viral impact. Well, with Snapchat and the fact that the content that you put up times out and it's not really shareable, it makes people feel a little bit more security in terms of what they can place. And the reason that's such a sort of selling point for the millennial crowd is that it has all the benefits of a social network, connecting with your friends, engaging with them, seeing what's going on in their life, but it's kind of missing the grandma effect. There's less worry that your mom or your grandmother will see what you're like with your friends. So it's comforting for them. They feel like they can be more real and more true to who they are, whereas on other social channels, they feel like they sort of have to be a little more careful and put up a more polished front or a more polished image. Now, we need to understand that from that side, it's going to impact both what types of businesses are going to use it and how it's going to be a fit for them. So if you're asking yourself if this is a space that you need to play in, a lot of it's going to come down to that starting question of whether or not you're a B2B focused company or a B2C focused company. Now, there's a few high-tech brands like GE, HubSpot that tend to play pretty successfully in this space, B2B businesses. But mostly you're going to find a higher focus and a higher adoption rate among not just B2C brands, but B2C brands who target millennials. So a much younger skewing product. If your primary target audience for your B2C company is people ages 40 and up, it's probably not going to be the place that you're going to see a lot of success right at this moment. But if your company is the type that really has a high adoption rate and a high focus on that younger audience, and if you've got a little bit more of a kind of hip or relaxed or, freewheeling nature to your sort of your brand image, there's a much higher chance that you're going to be successful playing in this particular social channel. Now, there's a couple things that you need to keep in mind in terms of what marketing on Snapchat looks like. And one of the biggest ones is the idea that there's no heavy selling. There's not really any direct push or selling. A lot of the things that would be viewed as acceptable when you were on Facebook or Twitter or even Instagram makes you kind of come across a little more shady, a little more like a used car salesman on Snapchat. So you need to make sure that you're coming into it with a much more playful interaction. And while you can absolutely include discount offers or, specials or things that motivate people to purchase, you want to make sure that you're doing it in a way that feels a little bit less pushy and a little bit more like you're engaging in sort of playful banter and some fun with them. You also might want to consider that if the audience that you primarily target is not that younger millennial brand, it might still be worthwhile to kind of watch through this video series, get an understanding of Snapchat and how it works, but maybe to just watch and observe for a little while. Because for many brands, there's the potential that in another year or two, we're going to see the audience start to age up, or we might see adoption rates expand to include different demographics. We are starting to see higher adoption rates in, 30-year-olds and 40-year-olds with Snapchat, but it's still a little slower moving. And it kind of still remains to be seen whether or not we'll get the broader buy-in that we've seen happen on other channels, again, like Pinterest or Instagram, on Snapchat, or whether it will stay with that younger demographic. Now, currently, the demographic on Instagram, we've talked about the fact that it's really young, but it's also important to keep in mind that right now it's made up of about 70% women, and 71% of the users of Snapchat are under 25. So again, that's going to heavily skew which businesses are going to find a lot of value in it, because it's going to come down to who your target audience is. That's why when it comes down to deciding whether or not this is going to be a channel for you, you need to keep in mind what I said earlier, that Snapchat is not currently a top-tier social network. It's a secondary social network. And there's the very real possibility that it may stay that way. Again, a channel like LinkedIn has been around for years and years and years. It's established, everyone is aware of it, but it's not the type of place that everybody across a broad demographic goes to every single day. It's more of a niche area. So it's possible that Snapchat will stay like that, or it may fade out entirely. As we see places like Facebook competing against it with Instagram. You really need to take the time to go through the course, spend a little bit of time playing around with it, getting a feel for it, understanding what it's like, and then gauge its value to you and decide whether or not it's the type of place that makes sense for your company to invest some marketing time and effort in. Now, going through some of the pros and cons of Snapchat, it's important to understand what it has to offer to you, but also what some of the limitations are. So one of the biggest limitations is that, much like Instagram, there isn't any way to have a click-through. You can't get a direct link from a post to your site. So that leaves you a couple of options. The primary one is kind of communicating to people, giving them some information, and then making use of something like a tiny URL, or encouraging people to take a screen cap, as the image passes by, to take that little screen cap using their the tools on their phone, so that they can go back and look at it and end up typing it into their computer or typing it in, on their mobile device. But that's really a big limitation. One, because it makes it hard for people to take immediate action and, go straight from that posting that you've given them into the link that you want them to get to. But also because it makes it a lot harder to track. Now, clearly, if you're using something like a tiny URL, that's going to give you some ability to, have some tracking code enabled there and be able to see what the pass-through rate is, who's making use of it. But it's still a lot more difficult to know what's the lag time between when they see it and when they actually type it in. Are you certain that they clicked through from, the Snapchat link, or did someone maybe see it on Snapchat, share it on another channel, and people picked up that tiny URL and put it from there? So it does make it a little bit harder to do your measurement. Now, the upside is this is a channel that kind of harkens back to those really early days of social media, when it was a little looser and easier and a little more freewheeling. So for a lot of companies, it's a refreshing place to engage and play. Again, because it doesn't have to be quite so polished. You're using your finger to draw something on a screen, or, to add stickers here and there. And that's generally how pretty much everyone uses it. So especially if you're a smaller company and you don't have the same production capabilities that a lot of other brands do, this is a place where it's a little bit less noticeable. And again, you have a little bit more freedom to, kind of play on par with the bigger companies. So looking at it as a place where you have the possibility to build brand equity instead of purely focusing on conversions, that opens up the door for it to maybe be a nice distraction for your team, to get a chance to get in there, to do some playing, to do some testing, and just to get a feel for what the response is. Now, we also have the idea of discovery and, that potential downside of the fact that there isn't a social ripple. So we talked earlier about how no social ripple is viewed as a plus for the millennial audience, because they don't have to worry about their message spreading so far. But of course, as a business, that's one of the primary reasons that we engage in social media, is we want our message to be shareable, to be spreadable. Now in Snapchat, because there's not really the ability to have that happen, it's a lot more difficult to build momentum. In fact, Snapchat doesn't do anything to make recommendations to people of, who to follow or what brands they might want to engage with. So it usually means that you're going to need to rely on some combination of paid exposure or making use of your other channels and letting people know that they can find you on Snapchat to gain those followers and to gain those connections. Now, the upside that comes back is, well, ads are still pretty expensive. Snapchat does let you import phone numbers from your phone, like from your contact list, to find out who on your contact list has a Snapchat account so that you can instantly send those connection requests. Now, what a lot of businesses are doing, especially smaller ones that, maybe have couple thousand couple thousand contacts instead of, databases of millions, is that you can import the phone numbers from your CRM into the contacts of your phone and then let Snapchat crawl those contacts and follow the list. And that can be a good starting point. Again, for those smaller brands, it's a great way to get in there pretty easily and set up those starting points without necessarily having to pay for all the ads. Now, the measurement side, again, becomes a fairly big downside because analytics are almost non-existent. In fact, you don't even get a follower account on Snapchat. You just get sort of a proprietary score that no one knows exactly what it's made up of, where Snapchat kind of ranks, how prevalent are you as a brand? That's going to be a combination of how many followers you have, how often you post, how much people engage with you. So it's a lot harder to really understand sort of your positioning. Now, also, you can measure the views, how many people view a message you put out there. You can measure how many of them take a screen cap or a screen capture of what you put out, and you can measure replies. But much like your snaps, much like the messages you put up, that data vanishes. In fact, it's only available for 24 hours. So unless you have someone going in every single day to pull that data down, it's going to be very difficult to do any type of long-term measurement. Now, the upside of this is that there are some things you can measure. You can measure the views of each snap within a story, and we'll talk more about stories and what they look like in the next section. But you do have some ability to figure out, sort of how far into the mix people get, to kind of say what's the drop-off rate, what's the interest in what we're putting out there, and sort of get a feel for what people like and for how engaged they are with particular content. Now, again, it's hard to connect it to much more than that. So think of it as sort of a flash in the pan view of your popularity, and that's about it. So as we move into the next couple lessons within this training module, I want you to come at it from the angle of familiarizing yourself with the marketing opportunity and then make the commitment to spend a little bit of time checking out the channel and running some tests. Don't go, full bore, hey, we've got to take over Snapchat. But again, just get in there, do a little bit of playing around and look to see, do we get a response? Are we finding some of our audience there? Have we uploaded our CRM and checked to see, what percentage of them actually have accounts? If it's just a teeny tiny fraction, you probably don't need to go any further than that. But you may be surprised to find that you do have a decent amount of people that you engage with otherwise in business that also happen to have Snapchat accounts. And if that's the case, you're going to want to put a little bit of time and effort into saying, hey, maybe this is something that's worth doing some testing and figuring out how people respond to things. Now, our key takeaways from this video are things like, with over 200 million active users, most of whom are under 25, Snapchat has definitely crossed the threshold and become a second-tier social channel that's worth considering. Now, Snapchat does not allow for direct link click-throughs, so you need to make sure that you have in the back of your mind to find other ways to push for calls to action. Snapchat has virtually no discovery. That means you're going to have to work pretty hard to gain followers. Snapchat measurement is still in its infancy. That makes it a little more difficult to get a solid grasp on the long-term impact of your efforts, and that's something you want to keep in mind in terms of your measurement. And also, Snapchat is not a channel right now that's going to be necessary for every business, so consider your time investment carefully.